Members, the Housing Committee on the Standards and Accreditation Bill is resumed. Members, before the dinner break we were debating Part 1. Fletcher Tabito had the call and he has 4 minutes, 35 seconds remaining if he wishes.
Thank you, Mr Chair.
Fletcher Tabito.
Special delight to carry on speaking after dinner. What I'd started saying, sir, was that the intent of this bill, when you look at it on paper, sir, is wonderful. It says something to the effect that the New Zealand Standards and Accreditation system functions well, meets the need of business, regulators and consumers, and we're going to consolidate and conform and make it all work well. And that sounds fantastic. But actually, when you, we're at a stage now, sir, where we've come to our Committee of the Whole, and there has, despite good and respectful and intelligent contributions from the public, from industry, from experts, sir, I would assert, and I will go through each part point by point, that the government has not listened. They do not seem to have taken any of that good advice on board, and so we stand here today, and the meaning and the essential nature of this debate is so important tonight because the government and its members need to hear that there are still issues. For example, and it was spoken to earlier, one of the key concerns centres around the lack of independence of the approval board, sir, and the renamed Accreditation Council. It was raised in committee. Many submitters spoke to the apparent lack of independence, and they spoke about how it's being absorbed into the MB structure. And so just as a commentary on the MB structure, it was a laudable goal to bring all these disparate parts together and try and create some synergies with this kind of super ministry. But sir, it is a disparate conglomeration of dysfunctional parts, and if we add this to that MB structure, sir, I don't think, and I assert strongly that you will not achieve what the government sets out and puts down in paper. There have been no substantial changes to the appointment process. This was raised many a time, sir. I spoke on it myself. Members of the opposition spoke on this repeatedly, that the minister, sir, has too much power. The minister is in charge of the appointment of every single person on this board, of this committee, and sir, it's not good enough. Ministerial appointments and the orders of council bypass the democratic process, where we assert, sir, New Zealand First asserts that we are bypassing the democratic process and we are not giving each and every New Zealander their say. So there was a part in the legislation where it speaks about, yeah, the minister can appoint on advice from the industry, but that is an option. It's not absolutely required, sir. So it's still too much power for the minister. It's reflective of many of the National Party's legislation of late, where more and more of the selection of panels, of advisory committees, of boards are in the hands of the minister and seem to bypass a good and reasonable and fair democratic process in terms of selection and therefore in terms of representation. We continue to be concerned with statements made by the regulatory impact statement that if the new body sat within the Ministry, Business, Innovation and Employment, there would be cost savings. Whilst the legislation speaks about recovering costs, actually when you do the analysis of that piece, those parts, sir, it's pretty hard for the government to prove that, yes, actually, yeah, it's in the legislation that will recoup our costs, but it hasn't been proven, sir. The analysis on the advice given still suggests that this government actually is not creating efficiencies. Mr Chair. Thank you, Mr Chair. This government is not creating efficiencies, and it's... You've thrown me, Bennett. So New Zealand First strongly believes that our much valued international reputation is regarding safe accredited standards for goods and services processes or practices will not be upheld. So one of the submissions was from one of our Australian counterparts, sir. And the Australian Standards Authority, excuse me if I've got the name wrong, spoke very clearly about Section 20 of the bill and how there was a lack of clarity in terms of understanding just what the legislation set out to achieve. So, you know, we're being advised by comparable bodies, comparable groups from our brother across the Tasman there, our cousin across the Tasman, and they're telling us that there is ambiguity in the legislation. They're suggesting that it needs to be tightened up. And so that was Section 20, but all parts of it. And so, for example, the Clause 3, sir, we talk about, and it's been discussed, about replacing the word public with individuals. And it was about a definition, and it was about accountability, and it was bringing it down, literally, to the individual so that we knew what we were trying to achieve. What is the public? What does that mean? Whereas if we're dealing on an individual basis, we have some clarity, we have some understanding. In Clause 4.1, sir, there was a lot of debate around the definitions used in the legislation. So, for example, accreditation is a term that was central to the purpose of the bill, but testing and testing laboratory are adequately defined in other pieces of legislation. So, you know, there's redundancy in the legislation, and it just adds to the confusion because actually the bill itself is confusing as a whole. The next one, sir, Clause 4.2, 17, talks about conflicts of interest. The proposed amendments would target those with a personal conflict that was so large as to have a real bearing on the carrying out of the undertaking as a board member, as a committee member, and in the expert role. But I think what we should do here and what we acknowledge is that the approach taken in Clause 17 as introduced could have cast its net more broadly than intended and excluded some experts, may have excluded some experts with knowledge crucial to the Standards Development Committee. So whilst we applaud on the one hand, sir, that there is definitely the possibility of the conflict of interest and it needs to be addressed, the definition in the legislation, sir, is actually perhaps too broad, it was suggested, and that actually experts themselves might be considered as being defined as having a conflict of interest, and so that they wouldn't be able to contribute to the discussions as per relevant standards, sir. It was recommended, sir, that in Section 16A, requiring nominees to declare any personal interest at the time of nomination, so this could be part of the solution, provide more detailed functions of the committee chairperson so that you understood exactly where the conflict of interest might lie. Those were just some suggestions presented to the Select Committee, and again, there doesn't seem to have been any movement, and there doesn't seem to have been any attempt to listen to the advice provided. It was recommended, Clauses 7 and 20. Clause 7 would require the Standards Executive Work Programme to be published and make clear that access to archive standards. So that there was access to the standards so that we saw what the decision-making process was. It's technical, but in terms of your standards and accreditation, how else are you going to go back and understand what it is that has come before and what it is that you are trying to achieve? Clause 20.
Call Brett Hudson.
Thank you, Mr.